Thank you, Dr. Chatterjee. Today I'll be speaking about the work that we've been doing for USAID in partnership with CERC for the last year. The purpose of the work was to identify key regulatory challenges that India will face at both the central and state level for integrating 175 gigawatts of renewables by 2022, and review areas in the US that have faced similar challenges to see if we can draw upon relevant regulatory experience for regulators here in India. This is our first public presentation on the work, so thank you to USAID and GIZ for inviting us to speak today. And I wanted to say a special thank you to Dr. Chatterjee and Joint Secretary Jyoti Arora for their feedback and support throughout this whole project. We look forward to continuing the partnership over the next year. Just briefly about E3, we're a 50-person consulting firm based in San Francisco, California, that works primarily in the electricity sector. We consult across a number of different client types, regulatory agencies, utilities, independent power companies, which enables us to have a 360 view of the industry. We're also working in some of the most rapidly changing markets in the US right now. California, New York, Hawaii, which are all charting their way to 100% renewables, which has given us an insider's view on the economic and operational challenges and successes of renewable energy integration. I'll skip over this in the interest of time. Project overview. So this project, USAID's partner in greening the grid for regulatory cooperation is NARUC, the National Association of Regulatory Utility Commissioners. And NARUC has engaged with E3 and the Regulatory Assistance Project, a nonprofit based in the US, to identify regulatory solutions to help inform more efficient power system operations under high penetrations of renewables in India. The project focused on market design and imbalance mechanisms to address renewable integration was made up of 4 parts. The first was to do a comprehensive review of regulation and practice in India today, and then review relevant US experience to be able to map to India. We also conducted several exchanges of both Indian and US regulators to India and to the US, and then take all this information and try to map the US experience to the Indian context, which is still ongoing. The first 3 components of the work have been culminated with the publication of our regulatory analysis and primer, which will have a lot more detail than I can go through today. So I suggest if you have any questions to please look at that document. I'm also here if you have any questions over the next couple of days. We had a lot of the context set earlier today, so I won't spend a lot of time here. But the scale of the integration challenge in India is obviously 175 gigawatts by 2022. And as of early 2016, Tamil Nadu and Rajasthan ranked first and second, respectively, for installed capacity of renewables in India. Going forward, it's also expected that most of the renewables that will be added to the system are going to be coming online in the western and southern regional grids. And so this suggests that the concentration of solar and wind resources in these limited number of states and regions means that being able to efficiently deliver power across all of India's grid is going to be key to integrating renewables. So the first piece of our work was to understand what is happening in India from a regulatory perspective today and how current operations were happening. And so we did a comprehensive review of current and draft regulations that focused on electricity dispatch, renewables, market design at both the central level and then in 2 states. So we focused on Tamil Nadu and Rajasthan given their experience with high penetrations of renewables to date. And these are some of the entities that we met with. We did extensive field research, spent several weeks in country, and we're very appreciative for the time that we were able to get from all of these actors in this space. In doing this, we were able to identify 4 priority areas for increasing system flexibility in India. The first was economic dispatch of renewable energy. And so here we really wanted to find the policy and regulatory frameworks that could enable least cost dispatch of all barriers to trade, least cost dispatch of all generation, including renewable energy, as a strategy for economically managing renewable energy curtailment. This is closely related to regional coordination, which Dr. Chatterjee mentioned earlier, which is looking at cooperative arrangements between states that could reduce barriers to trade for renewable generation, as well as enabling greater coordination and dispatch. The third piece is generation and load flexibility, which has also been talked about a number of times here. And so looking at new incentive designs to be able to increase the flexibility on coal generation units and loads. And the last piece are the roles and responsibilities and authority with the evolving power sector. Given how quickly things are changing in India right now, how do the allocation of roles and responsibilities need to change to keep up with that evolution? There are also two other areas that we identified as being important, which are on the right-hand side: least cost generation and transmission planning, as well as renewable energy contract design and incentives. We think these are important for system flexibility as well, but we're not focused on in our work. So we wanted to find a similar area in the US to India to be able to draw experience from. And when we did a review, we thought that the Western US looked the most similar to India for a number of reasons. And so you have the Western US on the right-hand side compared to India on the left. And in the Western US, we have multiple balancing areas. It's very similar to how India operates today with individual states. These balancing areas have to balance their load and generation on an intra-hour, hourly basis. They also have had limited exposure until recently to centralized markets. And so most of their trading with neighbors has happened on a bilateral basis or through trading hubs. Similarly to India as well, there are several states that house the majority of renewables for the entire region. In the southwest is most of the solar resources, and then in the northwest and the Rocky Mountain region has a lot of the good wind resources. In addition, a lot of the new generation that's coming online are renewables, and therefore looking at how they get access to the system is important. And we're seeing that there's an increasing share of independently owned generators in the US as it is in India as well. So this is a look at how we are seeing renewable energy integration in the Western US right now. And this is a sort of typical day in May when you have 50% renewables, which is the target in California right now. You can see that our glass fleet is going to be operating at minimum, subject to sort of a PMIN constraint. And then in the middle of the day, when we have all of our solar online, we're going to have to curtail because we don't have enough net load to meet it. Then as the solar drops off, we're going to have ramps at the end of the day to meet the increasing peak, and that's going to cause increasing imports from neighboring areas. And this sounded very much similar to a lot of the system operators we were talking to here, and just seeing how they're starting to see some of these issues crop up under high renewables today. So we looked at 3 case studies in the US: the California ISO, PacifiCorp, and Public Service Company of Colorado. These three case studies are looking to transition their markets away from what they are now to help better integrate renewables going forward. And so we thought it would be helpful to talk about that today. Some important developments in the case study areas are that they're moving towards much higher penetrations of renewables. The Cal ISO right now is going to 50% by 2030, but there's potentially 100% renewables by 2045 in the legislation right now. PacifiCorp in Oregon is going to 50% renewables by 2040, and Colorado is going to 30% by 2020. In addition, they're transitioning to regional markets, as I said. The Cal ISO and PacifiCorp created the Western Energy Imbalance Market. PacifiCorp created a similar balancing service called Joint Dispatch. And in addition to this, I'll also add that PacifiCorp and Colorado, Public Service of Colorado, have high percentages of coal in their fleets as well. So we can learn from how they're able to more flexibly operate their coal fleet. In the interest of time, I won't spend a lot of time on here, but these are some of the research questions that we identified as being important to answer for each of these priority areas and trying to draw out the relevant experiences from the case studies. The primer goes into answering each of these in more detail. So the market transitions that we're going to talk about today are energy imbalance market and joint dispatch service. The energy imbalance market is a bid-based real-time market that covers at least 12 utilities by 2019 and several others that are looking to join in the next 5 years. It was created by PacifiCorp and the California ISO in 2014 and just focuses on intra-hour balancing. It doesn't directly affect anything up until the start of the hour. Joint dispatch service is also a similar service that happens in Colorado, except this isn't through a market. This happens sort of on a cost-based service that is on an intra-hour basis as well. And similarly, it doesn't affect day or hour ahead scheduling. What we thought would be important from these two experiences is that they're happening now, and so there's an opportunity to learn for external audiences and potentially leapfrog any mistakes that are being made and sort of leverage the learnings that are happening in real time. So at a high level, how do things work today versus in a balancing market? Well, the BAU practice is that on a sub-hourly basis, there's very few bilateral transactions. There isn't really a mechanism to make this work given the current conditions. Anything that has to get scheduled on a bilateral basis has to be done 30 minutes before the hour, and it's manual dispatch for each of the individual BAs. Similarly, you have to reserve transmission capacity ahead of time. So if you're not utilizing it within the hour, there's no real secondary, or there aren't very liquid secondary markets to be able to use that. Under Joint Dispatch Service, or EIM, this is all automated. And so if you are part of the service, you put in your available transmission capacity as well as any generation that you want to be available within the hour, and there's a centralized clearing market that takes care of all of it for you. And so it utilizes unused transmission within the hour, and it sort of nets, it creates sort of a least cost dispatch across the greater balancing area. Again, this doesn't do anything to your hour ahead scheduling or reserves, and so this is really sort of just an incremental intra-hour piece. Some key insights from the case studies in each of the key priority areas. First, we'll talk about economic dispatch. And so I think the first thing that that was actually been mentioned earlier today are that wind and solar resources are increasingly being viewed as being dispatchable rather than just must run. And they can provide the same types of services, voltage control, frequency response, and ramping support as conventional generators. And this is done by curtailing their output. So there's been a shift in thinking about wind and solar as dispatchable, and similarly, there should be a shift in thinking about wind and solar curtailment as rather a reliability problem now to more of an economic question as to how much curtailment is economic. And so when you look at this from a regulatory perspective, we found that the resolution of renewable energy-related congestion issues has really mirrored a lot of the open access policies that have been put in place by our Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. Open access to the transmission system enables third-party generators, essentially non-utility-owned generation, access to utility-owned transmission. And as part of that, they have access to energy imbalance and congestion management services. These services help discover prices for things like curtailment, which can help move towards economically dispatching all generation. In addition, you can put things on AGC, like I mentioned before, and dispatch software, which can minimize system costs and maximize the value of your renewable energy. There are limitations to cost-based mechanisms, however, though, and that's why we're starting to see, as vertically integrated utilities are sort of hitting their max with the cost-based mechanisms, they're moving more towards these market mechanisms, which we'll discuss next. So regional coordination, we talked about just the balancing mechanisms here. You can also go all the way to centralized day-ahead dispatch, which actually several of these case studies are looking at. And with the higher penetrations of renewables, along with the availability of some of these lower cost, low risk regional coordination mechanisms like balancing markets, it's really facilitated regional coordination successes in the Western US. Multiple approaches to this have been done, so there isn't sort of a one answer fits all. We saw that Joint Dispatch Service and EIM were two versions of this. There's also many others. What's most important is that there's broad stakeholder engagement and clear value propositions for doing this. It's really important to build consensus, internal evaluation for adopting this within a utility, and it's also important for external purposes, for being able to potentially get regulatory approval and also stakeholder engagement. Something that's also been really important in the Western US is the California ISO every quarter now publishes an ex post verification of benefits. So most participants that have joined the EIM have done a study to understand what their potential benefits to of joining the market look like. And in every quarter now, the ISO has been able to verify and quantify the amount of benefits to each participant. I think it's upwards of about 200 million since the inception in 2014 now. Something that we've talked a lot about today is being able to increase resource flexibility. So both the balancing markets are able to create price signals for resources to evaluate operational changes to harness flexibility. One of the case study utilities that we visited was Pacificor up in Oregon. And they told us this anecdote that I thought was really interesting, which is when they were able to show the financial implications of certain operational patterns to their coal plant operators, it was able to give the operators another view into how they should operate the plants. And so they were able to think more creatively on how to improve processes and increase plant flexibility and profitability. And they actually were able to bring down their P-mins on their thermal facilities down to about 20% of their nameplate capacity without having to do major sort of retrofits or investments into their plants. The last piece is looking at the roles and responsibilities and authority and how that changes over time. Market transitions lead to a need to clarify the roles and responsibilities for various authority for various responsibilities. We focused on forecasting, scheduling, and balancing in the primer, and we found is that the level of regional coordination increases as you start to centralize more things, the more utilities have to cede their authority in each of these to the market operator. And so this is something to consider in terms of implementation. If there's a faster timeline, it probably means that you want to be transitioning fewer of these roles over. It's also important to have governance principles that define matters which market operators do and do not have jurisdiction over, particularly in systems where you have a central and state level jurisdiction. You want to make sure that the lines are very clear. And there's no sort of stock answer to the timing of how these things get done. The nature and timing of the transitions really depend on the extent that you can leverage existing institutional knowledge, structures, software. The ability of the EIM to come up so quickly was because the California ISO had a lot of the tariff language in place, they had the software in place, and so they were able to leverage that really quickly. In other markets, like in MISO, they had to build a lot of that up from the very beginning when they transitioned. So the regulatory primer is just the first step in trying to map relevant U.S. experience to the rapidly evolving Indian electricity sector. And in this presentation, we only at a very high level went through some of the key takeaways from the U.S. experience. But the idea is that we're going forward, we're scoping this at the moment, is looking at regulatory and market guidelines with more concrete short-term and medium-term milestones for integration issues, challenges, and facilitated market structures. And so we hope to continue the partnership and exchanges with CERC and FOR on renewable integration issues going forward. This is just a picture from our exchange back in August last year.